I woke up to find my car missing, vanished from my own driveway. No theft report, no tow notice, just a smug HOA violation taped to my door, demanding $500 for unauthorized vehicle removal. But what they didn't know, I'm a judge. And they just broke the law. James Carter had spent most of his life in the heart of the city, where the sound of sirens was as common as the honking of impatient drivers. So when he finally bought a house in a quiet, well-manicured suburban neighborhood, he thought he was in for a life of peaceful weekend barbecues and friendly waves from the neighbors. He was wrong. From the moment he pulled his sleek black Mercedes into the driveway of his new home, he had the distinct feeling that something was off. The houses were pristine, the lawns perfectly trimmed, and the mailboxes all identical. A Stepford-like uniformity that made his legal instincts tingle. It was the kind of place where people followed rules to a fault, and that usually meant one thing: an overzealous homeowners association. James wasn't against structure. As a judge, he respected law and order. But he also knew the kind of people who thrived in petty positions of power. It wasn't long before he met her. Karen Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed enforcer of all things unnecessary, approached him within hours of his moving truck pulling away. A woman in her late 40s with an aggressively short blonde bob and a clipboard seemingly fused to her hand, she wore the smug expression of someone who had been in charge for far too long. "Hello there. You must be the new resident," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm Karen, the president of our HOA. Just wanted to welcome you to our lovely community." James had barely shaken her hand before she handed him a packet of rules thicker than most legal briefs he'd encountered in court. "We have very strict guidelines here," she continued. "I assume you read through the welcome email?" James had not. "Right," he said, flipping through the binder. "No holiday decorations before December 1st. Grass must be kept under 3 inches at all times. Garbage bins must be out of sight within 3 hours of collection." He arched a brow. "You really run a tight ship, don't you?" Karen beamed. "We find that rules keep the neighborhood looking perfect. We all do our part." Something about the way she said that made James suspect she expected him to do more than his part. Over the next few weeks, things got stranger. The first incident happened on a Saturday night. James had just settled in, enjoying a rare glass of whiskey while reviewing some case files when the power suddenly went out. The whole house went pitch black. He peered outside. Every single house on the street was fully lit, except his. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and made his way to the breaker box in the garage. Nothing seemed tripped. His electric bill was paid, so that wasn't the issue. He was about to call the utility company when he noticed something peculiar. A faint buzzing noise came from the side of his house. James stepped outside and walked toward the sound, stopping abruptly when he spotted a metal box near his electricity meter. One that hadn't been there before. Attached to it was a small device with blinking lights. Now, James wasn't an electrician, but he had enough experience with legal disputes to know when something shady was going on. Before he could investigate further, a voice startled him. "Having some trouble, neighbor?" He turned to see his next-door neighbor, Lisa, standing on her porch, arms crossed. She was in her 30s, wore a hoodie and leggings, and had the kind of tired but knowing expression that suggested she had seen this all before. "Power's out in my house," James said. "Everyone else's seems fine." Lisa sighed. "Yeah. That happens sometimes, especially when Karen doesn't like someone." James narrowed his eyes. "Are you telling me the HOA has something to do with my electricity?" Lisa gave him a "you're not gonna like this" look. "Let me guess, you parked in your driveway?" James frowned. "Of course. Where else would I park?" Lisa shook her head. "Big mistake. Karen hates that. Says cars in driveways disrupt the uniform aesthetic. She prefers them in garages." James exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. "And shutting off my power is what? Punishment?" Lisa shrugged. "Not officially. But let's just say you're not the first. A few people have had random utility issues when they didn't follow HOA rules." James clenched his jaw. This was starting to feel less like a homeowners association and more like a dictatorship. Deciding to deal with it in the morning, he turned in for the night. When he woke up, his power had mysteriously returned. But that wasn't the only surprise waiting for him. On his way out to grab coffee, he found a bright yellow HOA violation notice stuck to his door. Improper vehicle storage. Fine, $200. Failure to comply will result in further action. James laughed out loud. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. But he wasn't amused. He had spent years on the bench dealing with fraud, corruption, and petty criminals. He knew abuse of power when he saw it. He wasn't about to let a suburban dictator get away with this. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't done with him yet. And she had no idea who she was messing with. James had faced some of the worst criminals the city had to offer. He had seen con artists try to weasel out of fraud charges, gang members glare at him from the defendant's table, and white-collar criminals feign ignorance when caught embezzling millions. But never in his life had he encountered someone as audaciously petty as Karen Whitmore. After the mysterious power outage and the bogus HOA fine, James knew he was dealing with a control freak on a mission. He just didn't know how far she was willing to go. The next morning, James decided to handle things the legal way. He wasn't one for unnecessary confrontation, and he had a feeling that calm persistence would get under Karen's skin more than outright aggression. He walked down the street toward the HOA office, a small, unnecessarily fancy building near the community clubhouse. It had the distinct look of an overfunded bureaucracy: spotless glass doors, perfectly arranged decorative planters, and a tiny no loitering sign that gave off strong stay-in-line energy. Inside, an older woman sat behind the reception desk, typing furiously on an outdated desktop computer. She looked up as James approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely glancing at him. "Yeah, I need to speak to Karen Whitmore," James said, leaning on the counter. "It's about an HOA fine and some, interesting electrical issues." The receptionist sighed, muttering something under her breath about another one before picking up the phone. After a brief, whispered conversation, she looked back at him. "She'll see you now." James followed her directions to a ridiculously well-decorated office. Karen sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her lips curled in a satisfied smirk, as if she had been expecting this confrontation. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, motioning for him to sit. "I assume you're here about the violation notice?" James didn't sit. He folded his arms and gave her the same look he reserved for defendants who thought they could out-talk the law. "I don't know how things work around here," he said, "but in most places, you don't fine people $200 for parking in their own driveway." Karen gave a faux sympathetic shrug. The HOA guidelines clearly state that vehicles should be stored inside garages whenever possible. It keeps the neighborhood aesthetically consistent. "Aesthetically consistent," James echoed. "You mean like the power mysteriously going out in just one house on the street?" Karen blinked, then pasted on an innocent expression that wouldn't have fooled a child. "Oh dear, did you have electrical troubles? How inconvenient." "Yeah. Very inconvenient. Especially since it happened right after I parked in my driveway." "Coincidences happen," Karen said with a tight-lipped smile. "But back to your fine. Failure to pay within 5 days will result in further action." James narrowed his eyes. He wasn't about to be strong-armed by a woman whose greatest thrill in life was regulating mailbox paint colors. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice even but firm. "If I find out that my power was tampered with because of some HOA stunt, I will treat it as a criminal offense. And trust me, Karen, I know the law better than you do." For the first time, Karen's smile faltered. James didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out, feeling the unmistakable weight of her glare burning into his back. Later that night, James decided to investigate the electrical issue further. He wasn't an electrician, but he was good at spotting patterns. He grabbed a flashlight and walked around the side of his house, back to where he had noticed the mysterious buzzing box near his meter. Except now it was gone. James's stomach tightened. Someone had removed it. He wasn't alone in this thought. As he was kneeling to inspect the spot where the device had been, Lisa, his next-door neighbor, appeared at the fence. "Let me guess," she said, arms crossed. "It's missing now." James stood. "You saw it too?" Lisa nodded. "Yeah. I also saw a guy in an unmarked truck hanging around here late last night. He was messing with your meter, then he drove off about an hour before your power came back." James exhaled slowly. "Let me guess, this happens a lot?" Lisa sighed. "More than you'd believe. Karen's been running this place like her personal kingdom for years. She's harassed people into selling their homes, fined people into financial ruin, And let's just say, she has connections. James had heard enough. This wasn't just a petty HOA dispute. This was manipulation, fraud, and possibly even extortion. And Karen clearly hadn't counted on messing with someone who had the power to fight back. Still, James played it cool. Instead of confronting Karen again, he documented everything. He took photos of the electrical box's previous location, jotted down timestamps, and even contacted an electrical expert to ask about the kind of devices that could be used to shut off power remotely. What he found out was even more infuriating. Someone had likely used a kill switch device, a small external component that could be installed near an electrical meter to disrupt power. Legal? Absolutely. Common? Not at all. James filed all the information away. He wanted concrete proof before making his next move. But Karen wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, James walked outside to find his driveway empty. His car was gone. For a split second, his mind raced through every possibility. Stolen? Towed? He had parked it there last night. Then he saw it. A bright red HOA notice taped to his front door. Unauthorized vehicle removal. Per HOA policy, your vehicle has been impounded due to noncompliance. Contact HOA for retrieval information. Fine. $500. James stared at the paper, barely believing what he was reading. Karen had stolen his car. And she had no idea who she was messing with. James Carter had spent years on the bench watching guilty people squirm when they realized they were out of options. It was always the same. Arrogance in the beginning, a bit of bravado followed by the slow, creeping realization that they had pushed their luck too far. That moment, when confidence gave way to panic, was one of the rare parts of his job he genuinely enjoyed. He had a feeling Karen Whitmore was about to experience that moment firsthand. Still holding the HOA notice, James took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Anger wouldn't do him any good. Logic, patience, and the law, those were his weapons. And he had spent his entire career using them to dismantle people far more dangerous than a suburban dictator with a clipboard. His first step was to confirm what had happened to his car. If Karen had actually had it towed, there would be a paper trail. And if she didn't? Then this wasn't just an HOA dispute. It was grand theft auto. He pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. Dispatch, what's your emergency? No emergency. I need to check on a vehicle tow, James said, keeping his voice neutral. My car was removed from my driveway last night, and I want to verify if it was legally impounded. The dispatcher took his information, asked him to hold, and returned less than a minute later. We don't have any record of a tow for that vehicle, sir. James exhaled sharply. That meant one of two things. Either the HOA had used a private tow company, or Karen had done something even dumber. Thanks, he said, hanging up. He didn't bother calling the HOA office. Karen wasn't going to play fair, so neither was he. Instead, he decided to pay a visit to the local impound lot. If his car had been towed, it had to be there. By the time he arrived at Harvey's Auto Recovery, a rundown lot on the outskirts of town, James had already mentally prepared his strategy. He walked up to the window where a gruff-looking man in a grease-stained t-shirt sat flipping through a magazine. Morning, James said, flashing a polite smile. I'm looking for a black Mercedes sedan. It may have been brought in last night. The man, who had the dead-eyed expression of someone who had seen too much nonsense in his lifetime, glanced at him before tapping on his ancient-looking computer. Who towed it? The man asked. James resisted the urge to smirk. That's what I'm here to find out. The man squinted at the screen, then let out a short snort of amusement. Huh. Says here it was impounded by the HOA. But get this, it wasn't logged as a tow. James' spine straightened. What do you mean? The man turned the monitor so James could see. On the record, his car was listed under voluntary surrender. James stared at the words, then let out a disbelieving laugh. Oh, that's cute. That's real cute. The man nodded. Yeah. Thought it was weird myself. Usually, a tow has proper paperwork, signed authorization, storage fees, all that. But this. He tapped the screen. This says you gave them your car. James felt a slow, controlled rage settle in his chest. Karen had faked paperwork to make it look like he had willingly surrendered his vehicle. Big mistake. I need a printed copy of that file, he said calmly. The man hesitated. I probably ain't supposed to do that. James pulled out his court ID, not something he usually flaunted, but this wasn't a usual situation. He slid it across the counter. The man's eyes widened. "You're a judge." James nodded. "And what you're looking at is a forged legal document. If you print that for me, you're helping expose fraud. If you don't, well, I'll just subpoena it." The man didn't need more convincing. He hit print. James took the paper, tucked it into his folder, and turned to leave. "Oh, and one more thing," he said. "Where's my car now?" The man gestured toward the lot. "Back left corner." James walked through the yard until he spotted his Mercedes. It was filthy, with a bright orange sticker slapped across the windshield that read, "Unauthorized vehicle, pending removal." He chuckled. Karen really had no idea who she was dealing with. Without another word, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove right out of the lot. The impound guy didn't even try to stop him. As James pulled onto the street, he debated his next move. He could storm into the HOA office and demand answers, but that wouldn't be any fun. No, Karen had already played her hand. Asterisk asterisk, now it was his turn. Asterisk asterisk. Instead of confronting her outright, James went home and got to work. He pulled up county property records, reviewing the HOA's legal standing in the community. He found several gray areas in their policies, rules that were unenforceable, expired bylaws, and financial discrepancies that raised red flags. Then he contacted the local news. Nothing got under an HOA's skin like bad publicity. By the time he was finished, he had a folder of evidence, an official police complaint, and a scheduled interview with an investigative reporter who loved exposing corrupt HOA boards. Then and only then did he decide it was time to see Karen. He arrived at the HOA office just before closing. Karen, seated at her overly pristine desk, barely looked up as he walked in. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Have you come to pay your fine?" James dropped the printed impound report onto her desk. Karen's smug expression disappeared the moment she saw it. Her eyes flicked up to his, panic flickering behind them. "That," James said, voice measured, "is forged documentation. You had my car illegally impounded and falsely labeled it as a voluntary surrender." Karen swallowed hard. I don't know where you got this, but..." James cut her off. "Save it. I already spoke with the impound lot. Oh, and I should mention..." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Asterisk asterisk, "I'm a judge. Asterisk asterisk." Karen went pale. James savored the moment of realization in her eyes. "I've filed a formal complaint with the county, notified law enforcement, and, just for fun, tipped off a reporter about some of your more creative violations," he smiled. "Expect a camera crew sometime this week." Karen's jaw tightened, but she had nothing to say. James straightened. "You've got two choices. Resign from the HOA and return every penny you've extorted from homeowners, or watch this whole thing blow up in your face." Karen opened her mouth to argue but snapped it shut. She could see the checkmate. James smirked. "Take your time deciding. I'll be outside, asterisk asterisk, parking in my driveway, asterisk asterisk." Karen Whitmore had spent years ruling the neighborhood with an iron clipboard, and for the first time she was out of moves. James Carter had seen it before, that exact moment of realization. The moment a person in power finally understood they were finished. The moment arrogance turned to panic. It was usually in a courtroom under bright lights with a gavel at the ready. But today, it was in a tiny, overpriced HOA office, where the queen of petty bureaucracy had just realized she had lost her throne. James left her sitting there, her face pale and frozen, and walked out without another word. He didn't need to hear her excuses. He didn't need an apology. He had already won. By the time he stepped outside, Lisa was waiting for him near the sidewalk. Arms crossed, lips twisted in a knowing smirk, she looked like someone who had just won a bet with herself. "Judging by the look on your face," she said, "I'm guessing that went well?" James exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "She's done." Lisa's grin widened. "That fast? Damn. I knew you were a lawyer or something." James chuckled. "Close. I'm a judge." Lisa blinked. Then after a beat she burst out laughing. "Oh, that is so much better," she wheezed. "She had no idea, did she?" "Not a clue," James said, shaking his head. "She thought I was just another guy she could steamroll with fines and phony violations." Lisa clapped her hands together. "So what's next? Is she, like, getting arrested?" "Not yet," James said, glancing back at the office. But she's about to have the worst week of her life. He had notified law enforcement about the forged documents. He had tipped off an investigative journalist who was itching for a story on corrupt HOAs. And because James loved a little poetic justice, he had also filed a formal motion with the county to audit every financial transaction the HOA had made under Karen's leadership. She had no idea what was coming. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread fast when an official audit team showed up at the HOA office, escorted by a pair of county investigators. Even faster when a local news van parked outside and a reporter started interviewing homeowners about Karen's antics. James didn't even have to leave his house to enjoy the show. He simply brewed his coffee, stepped onto his porch and watched as Karen's empire crumbled. By noon she was forced to resign. By the end of the week she was under investigation for embezzlement. Turns out, those ridiculous HOA fees hadn't been going toward community beautification, after all. And by the following month, Karen Whitmore was officially banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. The neighborhood changed overnight. Without Karen, the new HOA board rolled back her most ridiculous rules. Driveway parking? Allowed. Lawn decoration restrictions? Gone. Surprise fines for made-up violations? A thing of the past. Lisa threw a Karen's Gone block party, complete with a piñata that suspiciously resembled a certain clipboard-wielding tyrant. And James? He enjoyed a peaceful HOA-free life. Until one day several months later when he ran into Karen again. It happened at the local grocery store. James was grabbing a bottle of wine when he heard a familiar clipped voice behind him. Paper or plastic? He turned. There she was, standing behind a cash register, wearing a store uniform with a name tag that read Karen W. For a split second she didn't recognize him. Then her eyes flicked to his and she froze. James smiled. Karen. Fancy seeing you here. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Enjoying your little victory? He shrugged. I didn't do anything except point out the law. He tilted his head. Which I have to say is a good thing to follow. Especially in retail policies. Wouldn't want to get in trouble for breaking any store rules. Karen's eye twitched. James took his time bagging his wine, giving her an extra polite nod before walking away. And as he left, he couldn't help but think. Sometimes karma really did have a sense of humor. Asterisk asterisk, what would you do if your HOA illegally towed your car, and you had the power to bring them to justice? If you love seeing entitled people get exactly what they deserve, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next crazy story.